For years, Joe Rogan had been one of the most influential voices in modern media. His podcast reached millions every week, touching on every subject imaginable, from science and philosophy to health, history, and religion. But when it came to Islam, like so many others in the West, his understanding had always been shaped by fragmented narratives. News headlines, Hollywood portrayals, political discourse. These were the sources that had constructed his image of the faith. It wasn't that he was hostile to it. He was curious, yet his curiosity had never been deeply answered with knowledge. What he carried instead were assumptions, questions, and the echoes of stereotypes that floated endlessly in Western culture. That all began to change the day he sat down with scholars who had spent their lives immersed in Islamic history, theology, and philosophy. The conversations didn't happen in one explosive moment, but through a gradual unfolding, like a series of doors opening in a long corridor he had never walked down before. The scholars did not lecture with arrogance. They spoke calmly, weaving together verses from the Quran, teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, and the long legacy of Islamic civilization. They didn't try to sell a narrative. Instead, they explained truths that had been preserved for centuries, truths that so few in the West had ever taken time to hear directly. At first, Joe was struck by the sheer depth of what he was being introduced to. The idea of Islam wasn't just about rituals or laws, as the media often portrayed. It was about an entire world, a way of seeing human life, morality, the universe, and even the nature of existence itself. He heard that Islam, in its very name, meant submission to God, or peace through surrender. That wasn't a political slogan. That was a spiritual reality, one that resonated deeply with the way he had often spoken on his show about ego, humility, and aligning oneself with something bigger than personal desires. The scholars reminded him of something he had heard in passing but never really thought about. The Quran is not just a religious text. It is believed by Muslims to be the literal word of God, preserved exactly as it was revealed more than 400 years ago. In a world where so many things are lost to time, distorted by translation, or manipulated by politics, the idea of something unaltered for over a millennium struck him as profound. Joe had always admired authenticity, whether in martial arts, comedy, or hunting. And here he was, confronted with the claim that Islam had preserved an unbroken authenticity at the very core of its faith. Then came the discussions on misconceptions, the common misunderstandings that shaped public opinion. Terrorism, oppression, violence, these were always the headlines. But the scholars explained that Islam condemns the killing of innocents, that it upholds justice, charity, kindness, and respect for women and family. Joe realized something uncomfortable. Much of what he thought he knew about Islam wasn't from Muslims at all, but from people with agendas, from media narratives that thrived on sensationalism. He saw how billions of peaceful Muslims across the world lived their lives quietly, far removed from the chaos of headlines. What hit him even harder was the recognition that many of Islam's principles weren't foreign to him at all. He had long spoken about discipline, self-control, and the importance of community. When he heard about prayer 5 times a day, fasting in Ramadan, or the giving of charity, he recognized those same principles of discipline and gratitude, just in a more structured and sacred form. The practices weren't arbitrary. They were designed to ground a person in humility and connection, day after day, year after year. Joe also began to learn about the intellectual heritage of Islam. It wasn't just a religion that shaped spiritual lives, it shaped civilizations. During the so-called Dark Ages in Europe, The Muslim world was thriving with advancements in science, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and literature. He was fascinated to hear that many of the ideas that had inspired the European Renaissance had roots in Islamic scholarship. Algebra, hospitals, optical science, even the foundations of modern medicine, so much of it came from Muslim thinkers. For someone who admired knowledge and innovation, this was a revelation. But perhaps the most striking moment for Joe came when the scholars explained how Islam viewed humanity. The Quran described mankind as created with dignity, purpose, and responsibility. Unlike the purely materialist lens of modern thought, Islam didn't reduce humans to random accidents of evolution or mere consumers in a capitalist machine. Instead, it placed humanity in a noble role, caretakers of the earth, accountable for their actions, designed with both intellect and soul. Joe felt this resonate with the conversations he often had about consciousness, morality, and the mysteries of human existence. Here was a system that had been grappling with these questions long before modern science and philosophy had put them into words. And yet all of this was still just the beginning. What Joe realized after these initial conversations was that Islam wasn't something that could be summarized in sound bites or reduced to stereotypes. It was vast, complex, and deeply human. It had answers to questions that people in the West often didn't even think to ask. By the end of that first encounter with true Islamic scholarship, Joe sat in silence for a while. His usual style was to jump in with humor, skepticism, or curiosity, but here he found himself absorbing. He wasn't being converted or pressured, he was being informed, and information has a way of breaking down walls that fear and ignorance build. For the first time, Joe Rogan truly began to see Islam not as an outsider, not as a headline, but as a living, breathing faith that billions held close to their hearts. It was no longer a mystery clouded by suspicion. It was a reality that demanded to be understood on its own terms. In the days that followed, Joe Rogan found himself replaying those conversations in his mind. It wasn't like a podcast guest who came and went, leaving behind a few interesting sound bites. This was different. The words of the scholars lingered, echoing whenever he reflected on life, purpose, or even during his quiet moments at home. He had been introduced to something that shook the foundations of what he thought he knew about religion, history, and spirituality. He started noticing how much of his world had been shaped by half-truths. For years he had leaned into the idea that religions were more or less the same, structures of control, systems designed to regulate people. But the scholars had challenged that, showing him that Islam wasn't about control for power's sake, it was about guidance. The practices weren't restrictions, they were disciplines intended to elevate a person above base instincts. The fasting wasn't about starvation, it was about mastering the self. Prayer wasn't about blind ritual, it was about recalibrating the soul 5 times a day. Charity wasn't a tax, it was a sacred act that equalized society and kept greed in check. Joe began to see the difference. What he once thought were chains, Muslims saw as keys. At night, he dove deeper into reading. He began pulling up translations of the Quran, listening to lectures online, and watching debates between scholars. He was struck by the balance of logic and spirituality that Islam seemed to maintain. The Quran spoke about the universe, the stars, the oceans, the cycle of life and death, all things he often marveled at on his show when speaking to scientists and philosophers. But here, those marvels weren't random. They pointed toward design, intention, and the reality of a creator. Joe had always respected science, but he also sensed its limits. Science could tell you how things worked, but it struggled to answer why they existed in the first place. The scholars had framed Islam as a faith that didn't dismiss science but invited it, that saw discovery as a way to appreciate the Creator more. The more he learned, the more he realized this wasn't a conflict between faith and reason. It was a marriage of both. He began to notice parallels with his own life. Discipline in martial arts had taught him humility and respect for structure. Hunting had taught him the sacredness of life, the responsibility of taking what you need without waste. Conversations with scientists had taught him the vastness of the universe. And now, Islam seemed to tie all of those threads together into a coherent whole. It was as if the scattered insights he had collected across decades of curiosity suddenly found a home in one overarching system. But it wasn't just the intellectual weight that struck him, it was the human element. He started meeting Muslims off camera, ordinary people who lived their faith quietly but firmly. He met families who invited him into their homes, showed him hospitality that went beyond courtesy, and spoke about life with a serenity he rarely encountered in Hollywood or the entertainment world. These weren't people obsessed with materialism or fame. They were people grounded by faith, anchored in something unshakable. That authenticity reminded him of the very thing he had always admired in fighters, hunters, and comedians: the raw, unfiltered truth of being who you are without pretending. Islam, as he was beginning to see it, wasn't about putting on a show. It was about living truth, even when nobody was watching. And then there was the issue of misconceptions, the heavy baggage that Islam carried in Western media. Joe was blunt enough with himself to admit that he had once been shaped by those same headlines. But now, as he looked deeper, he realized how distorted the lens had been. The idea that Islam was inherently violent didn't align with what he was seeing. The scholars showed him verses that commanded mercy, stories of the Prophet showing compassion, principles of justice that condemned extremism. He came to understand that what the world often blamed on Islam was, in reality, the product of politics, poverty, and manipulation. This realization unsettled him. How many millions had been conditioned, just like he had been, to see Islam only through fear? How many people had missed the beauty of a faith because they only saw the chaos at its margins? Joe began to recognize that this wasn't just about his personal understanding. It was about the broader cultural misunderstanding that dominated the West. That recognition sparked something new: responsibility. He knew his platform wasn't ordinary. Millions listened to him, trusted his voice, and followed his curiosity wherever it went. If he was now seeing a new side of Islam, didn't he owe it to his audience to let them see it too? Not as propaganda, not as preaching, but as an honest exploration, just like everything else he had ever done on his show. But Joe also knew this wouldn't be easy. Talking about Islam on a platform as massive as his meant walking into controversy. The moment he spoke about it with sincerity, critics would accuse him of bias, of being manipulated, of crossing lines. Yet the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this was exactly what he had always done. He had challenged assumptions, broken taboos, and asked the questions people were too afraid to ask. He wasn't thinking of converting or making any bold declarations. That wasn't the point. The point was truth, and truth, once glimpsed, was too powerful to ignore. So, Joe began preparing himself for the next stage. He wanted more scholars, more Muslims, more voices on his platform. He wanted to dig deeper, to strip away the stereotypes layer by layer, until the reality of Islam stood on its own. Not the Islam of headlines, but the Islam of lived experience, history, and scripture. And as he planned, he felt something he hadn't expected: peace. A strange calmness that came with knowing he was aligning himself, at least in his search, with something real. It wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about understanding. When Joe Rogan finally opened up publicly about his journey of exploring Islam, the ripple effects were immediate. Clips of his reflections spread across social media. Some people were surprised, others skeptical, and many Muslims worldwide felt a deep sense of appreciation. Here was one of the most recognizable voices in modern media, acknowledging truths about their faith that had been misrepresented for decades. But for Joe, this wasn't about going viral. It wasn't about controversy or headlines. It was about honesty. He spoke candidly about how meeting Muslim scholars and thinkers had shifted his perspective. He admitted how much of his earlier understanding of Islam had been shaped by the same surface-level narratives that influenced millions of others. And he explained with humility that the more he listened, the more he realized he had only scratched the surface. His studio, once a place of curiosity and comedy, began transforming into a space where profound discussions unfolded. He hosted scholars who spoke not only about faith, but about science, ethics, consciousness, and the future of humanity. These weren't debates designed to score points. They were conversations meant to reveal clarity. Joe approached them with his trademark mix of skepticism and wonder. But now, his skepticism wasn't rooted in dismissiveness. It was rooted in genuine hunger for truth. As these episodes unfolded, Joe's audience experienced something unusual. Instead of hearing the usual rhetoric about religion being outdated or divisive, they heard about Islam as a way of life, structured, balanced, and deeply human. They heard about the Prophet Muhammad's mercy, his justice, and his profound impact on civilization. They heard about the intellectual legacy of Muslims, the spiritual practices that grounded people, and the universal values that transcended culture. For many of his listeners, this was the first time they had ever encountered Islam explained without distortion. Privately, Joe found himself continuing to wrestle with questions. He read more of the Quran, often pausing at verses that spoke directly to the human condition, verses about patience, gratitude, justice, and the fleeting nature of life. He was struck by how timeless the guidance felt, how it applied as much to a 21st century world as it did to 7th century Arabia. It was as if the text anticipated the struggles of every generation, offering a compass that never lost its direction. What moved him most, however, wasn't only the intellectual strength of Islam, but the sincerity of Muslims he met. He saw athletes who attributed their discipline to faith, scientists who found inspiration in the Quran, families who lived with humility and joy. He noticed a recurring theme. Muslims weren't perfect, but their faith gave them something to strive for, something that anchored them against the chaos of modern life. Joe began reflecting on the emptiness that often haunted the West: the endless consumerism, the obsession with fame, the shallow chase for meaning. He had spoken about it countless times on his show, questioning why so many people in wealthy nations still felt lost and depressed. Now, for the first time, he saw how Islam offered an antidote. It didn't promise a life free of struggle, but it offered purpose in the struggle. It didn't erase pain, but it gave meaning to pain, and in that meaning there was peace. He wasn't naive about it. Joe understood that no religion could be reduced to a single narrative. He knew there were political conflicts, cultural differences, and extremists who distorted faith for their own ends. But he had also learned that judging Islam by its worst misrepresentations was as unfair as judging America by its worst criminals. The truth of a faith, he realized, could only be understood through its core teachings and the lives of the sincere people who practiced it. By now, Joe was speaking with a new level of conviction on his show. He encouraged his audience not to take his word for it, but to seek knowledge for themselves. He urged them to read, to listen, and to engage with Muslims directly rather than through media filters. His message was simple. If you want to understand Islam, go to the source. Don't let fear and ignorance be your only teachers. The more he spoke, the more he noticed something within himself. The questions that had once kept him restless, the search for meaning, the puzzle of morality, the wonder of existence, were being met with answers that felt both rational and spiritual. He hadn't declared himself Muslim, but he could no longer deny the respect he carried for the faith. In a world full of noise, Islam offered signal. In a world full of chaos, it offered order. In a world obsessed with ego, it demanded humility. And so, Joe Rogan's journey into understanding Islam became more than just a personal exploration. It became a mirror for millions of listeners who shared the same doubts, the same stereotypes, and the same hunger for truth. Through his voice, they too began to see Islam in a new light, not as a distant, foreign religion, but as a profound tradition with universal relevance. As he closed one of his most powerful episodes on the subject, Joe leaned back in his chair, pausing in the silence that followed. He didn't offer a conclusion because there wasn't one. Understanding Islam wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And like every journey worth taking, it was one step, one conversation, and one realization at a time. That was the moment Joe finally understood. Islam wasn't asking him to stop questioning. It was inviting him to ask better questions, deeper questions, questions that pointed not away from truth, but toward it.